The idea in Congress that we shouldn't talk to the Chinese, that we shouldn't talk to the Russians, that we shouldn't talk to Hamas. This is insanity on the highest order. The Federal Reserve, acting wisely, I believe, raised the interest rate, which collapsed the gold price. But it also took the stock market down, and it decimated the bond market.
Do you have any idea how the market's pulse is influenced by interest rates and gold prices? Follow Rick Rule as he explores a pivotal moment in financial history. According to Rick Rule, the shift in interest rates once halved gold's value, rattled the stock market, and tore through bonds. A narrative of economic nerve, congressional spending, and a wild inflation ride unfolds as we dive into this captivating analysis by Rick Rule. So, don't go anywhere. Stay connected with us until the end of this video because we will share important information.
Like the 1970s, particularly because in the 1970s, we had come off of 20 pretty benign years. Since the end of World War II, the United States had led the world in a fairly peaceful time from 1945, certainly through 1965.
Right.
Great credit markets, great equity markets, demographic expansion, peace, the expectation that things were only going to get better. While under the covers, things were getting worse because we had the confidence and because we tried to focus on more important things, we allowed for the inexorable rise of government. We developed this counterparty in our life that turned out to be a cancerous counterparty. In the United States in particular, our confidence led us to attempt to fight the war in Vietnam and the war on poverty simultaneously. By the way, we lost both wars.
Yeah,
and
indeed.
Trying to finance both guns and butter, we ran into a circumstance where we violated a wonderful old ditty. The ditty goes like this: when your outgo exceeds your income, your upkeep becomes your downfall. It was very clear to anybody who paid attention, which is to say any credit analyst, that by 1970, the fiscal course of the United States and the Western world was unsustainable. But because we'd been through 20 or 25 good years, people ignored the warning signs. They had been taught to buy the dips. They had been taught that interest rates only go lower. They had been taught that equity and real estate prices only go higher. So despite the fact that the financial condition of the United States in particular was deteriorating fairly rapidly, confidence reigned. Now, they did deregulate the gold price. So the gold price went up fairly precipitously, not merely because of the fear of inflation, but rather because it had been price controlled for 40 years. In the middle part of that decade, I am convinced myself that the inflation lesson hadn't been learned yet. But in the middle part of that decade, the Federal Reserve, acting wisely, I believe, raised the interest rate, which collapsed the gold price.
Right.
Gold had risen from $35 an ounce to $200 an ounce. Raising the interest rate took the gold price down by half. But it also took the stock market down, and it decimated the bond market. Congress lost their nerve, continued to spend like drunken sailors, while at the same time lowering the interest rate. When that happened, inflation went from the 7% range, as measured then, which is different than now, to the 12 or 13% range. And what that meant was that savings accounts were paying substantially less than the rate of the deterioration of the purchasing power of the dollar. And the gold price went parabolic, while the equity markets and the debt markets collapsed. In that sense, it seems to me that the decade that we're coming into resembles somewhat the decade of the 1970s. We have now come off 40 fairly benign years in the 1982 to 2022 period. I'm not trying to say there weren't some challenges, 2008, stuff like that. Mm-hmm. But we've come through a period of 40 years of declining interest rate, strong US dollar, and the strong US dollar moderated at least the impact of inflation. I think that's over. But I don't think that the confidence has subsided, which means that I think that there's going to be a 2 or 3 year hiatus period between the reality that a hardworking credit analyst might see, as an example, and the reality perceived by an investor, speculator, saver, or taxpayer who has been lulled into security by 40 benign economic years. Sean, don't confuse me with the doom and gloom guy. I think the world 15 years from now is going to be much better, almost unimaginably better than it is today. But I think we have to get from here to there. And I think we need to understand the nature of the improvement. The improvement is not going to come out of Washington or Ottawa or Brussels. The improvement is going to come because, at least in the United States, we are still such an innovative society. We are still so tolerant of success, at least for a while, that 5 or 6 young kids can commandeer a garage in Sunnyvale, California, and out pops Google or out pops Apple, which is to say that our individual creativity and tenacity is so spectacular that we have been able to and will continue to be able to afford our collective stupidity. But that assumes that each individual looks after his or her well-being. And I think that'll be the challenge for the next 10 years. The hubris of the global political leadership flirting with world war. Mm-hmm. The idea that we shouldn't talk to our enemies, but rather that we should disparage them for internal political purposes. This is an insanity. The idea in Congress that we shouldn't talk to the Chinese, that we shouldn't talk to the Russians, that we shouldn't talk to Hamas. This is insanity on the highest order. If you have a problem with somebody that's resulting in other people dying or your people dying, you owe it to yourself to find as much common ground with the other combatant as you possibly can. The idea that we're conflating Israeli casualties with Palestinian casualties as though one side is good and one side is bad. I'm not going to get into the underlying conflict. I'm not going to do that. What I'm trying to say is that we owe it to the world to prevent casualties to the extent we can. And one of the ways that we do that, no matter how odious we find certain aspects of the other side's behavior, if there is another side, we have to engage discussion. So that keeps me awake at night. I had the very, very, very good fortune to not have to fight the war in Vietnam, something that I'm eternally grateful for. That war was a war without purpose, like most wars. The second thing that keeps me up is somewhat more mundane and just somewhat more mundane. I think there's too much complacency in the world around government debt and around the reliance on other people to shape your life and to get ahead. And I think that there's too much complacency about the general deterioration in the purchasing power of fiat currency. Most of your readers, Sean, if you ask them about inflation, would direct you to the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, which I don't believe is a gauge of inflation. And I don't believe that most readers of yours or customers of mine have paid attention to the difference. And that bothers me. If you regard the CPI as a relevant measure of the deterioration of the purchasing power of your savings, you are underestimating that deterioration. Firstly, the CPI is a constructed index, which is to say is hedonistically adjusted. The people who put it together assign values to economic outputs.
Yes.
If an apartment today is bigger and better than an apartment 40 years ago, they hedonistically adjust it, not taking into account the fact that people need places to live. So that's one problem. It's artificial. A second problem is that when it's inconvenient for the organizers with regards to core inflation, they leave out food and fuel in terms of understanding the impact of our own cost of living. But the most idiotic aspect of the CPI is that it doesn't include tax. The cost of government is the biggest household expense for most working families in the Western world. It is larger than housing, food, energy, and transportation combined.
From Rick Rule's insightful perspective, we've witnessed a vivid account of economic interplay as interest rates impact gold, markets, and inflation. We are reminded of the intricate balance shaping our financial landscape through the story of fluctuating fortunes and market dynamics. Thanks for joining us on this enlightening journey through pivotal moments in economic history with Rick Rule. Before you leave, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for the next part of Rick's prediction about gold, silver, and uranium.